Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar on corporate low carbon transition planning. My name is Nicholas Blanco. I'm the Director of Corporate Low Carbon Transition Planning at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. We're excited to be sharing with you today the findings from our research on transition planning and some recommendations on how to help improve the transition planning process for companies and shift the focus from planning to performance. Before we start, I wanted to acknowledge a couple of my colleagues, Naila Karamali and Rosalie Reitz, who are instrumental in helping do the research and planning and report drafting for this. And then also Philip Horowitz on our communications team and the rest of our communication team who's brought together today's webinar and helped with the final report and all the other pieces of work that went into making this happen. So it truly was a team effort. So on to the presentation. I'm going to give an overview of the research and our findings, and then on recommendation to improve corporate low carbon transition planning. After my presentation, Rachel Kavanaugh, the global sustainability lead for Intel, is going to share some insights from Intel's process in developing their recently released transition plan. And then the balance of the time will be reserved for Q&A. So you can enter a question at any time with the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. So please do that. And hopefully we can get to your question at the end of the presentation. So if you go ahead and go to the next slide. In terms of the project itself, the focus was real economy sector companies. And the distinction here is real economy is everything but the finance sector. So the objective was to support and accelerate the development of credible low carbon transition plans, but more specifically to kind of understand the current state of transition planning, including the identification of hurdles, knowledge gaps that exist, and for those companies that have already developed their own transition plan, what are some best practices that can help companies that are just starting out on this journey? And then just to assess kind of those cross-sector interdependencies. So who are companies relying on to make a change in their sector, say, for utility decarbonization, in order for them to achieve their own carbon reduction goals? So we go to the next slide. So how did the project design? It had two main components. There was a research component and then interviews of real economy sector companies. We looked at two sets of guidance. If you've been paying attention to corporate transition planning, there was a first wave of guidance that was focused on the transition plan itself. So what elements should be in that transition plan? And then there was another wave of guidance on what makes a plan credible. So we gathered up those, looked at all those, crosswalked them to identify kind of commonalities across those and just to kind of identify what the transition planning landscape was. The other component of the project was to do interviews with real economy sector companies, and the sectors that we spoke to are outlined here: basic materials, consumer cyclical, communication, energy, technology. So we had a good group of representation in terms of real economy sector companies. So if we go to the next slide, the first step here is just let's level set a little bit in terms of what is a transition plan. So we go ahead to the next. In general, the transition plan is the company's strategy to achieve their own emissions reductions and to manage kind of the transition to a low carbon economy. So there's a couple of key pieces that should be in there. Obviously is the statement of the ambition that's embodied in the goal, and the ideal is to have a science-aligned goal that's consistent with the Paris Climate Agreement. And then a level of information and transparency necessary for stakeholders, investors, and others to understand kind of how the company is approaching their own decarbonization, how they're approaching the more economy-wide transition to a low-carbon economy, and the alignment of resources and advocacy to help make sure that plan comes into place. So if we go to the next slide, transition plans go by a lot of different names. So it's transition plan, climate transition plan, climate transition action plan, net zero transition plan. They're all roughly the same. I think we've seen is that in the box on the right there, a net zero transition plan seems to be gaining kind of the most currency of late. But for the balance of this presentation, we're gonna use the term low carbon transition plan to refer to all of these things. So we go to the next slide. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, defines in their guidance an overall corporate climate strategy, and that has two components to it: this climate change mitigation strategy and the climate change adaptation strategy. We're going to be specifically talking about the climate change mitigation strategy, or that low carbon transition plan. The United Nations is one of the bodies in their high-level expert group that put out guidance on what defines a credible plan. And they noted that the non-state actors, companies included, are going to be, necessary to scale ambition. And if without their participation, it increases the likely failure of companies meeting the ambition of the Paris Climate Agreement. I think the other bullet here from SCI Research also has found that companies that kind of lean into the transition plan, that are doing more work in terms of renewable energy, can see a benefit in terms of the upside in terms of revenue as compared to their peers. So if we go to the next slide, in terms of drivers, who is it that companies are listening to or influential in terms of getting them to set an ambition and develop a transition plan and then implement that plan. So if we go to the next slide, we've kind of outlined the universe of internal and external stakeholders. They all have different reasons and interest in terms of a company's development of a transition plan. For shareholders and board members, it's more about outlining the risks and opportunities in the transition, and there are opportunities for companies here. It's not just the management of risk, but what are those? How are they going to be managed? What needs to be happened? What impact will that have on the company? Management interested in terms of how, kind of at a lower level, how that's going to impact the operations of the company, what needs to be different, how will the company transform itself, employees, looking for purpose-driven work, but also want to make sure that, they won't be negatively impacted by any transition. On the external side, investors, creditors also have their own pressure to decarbonize their portfolio, and so are looking to real economy sector companies to decarbonize to help them achieve their own goals. So that's the kind of the primary linkage between the financial sector and the real economy sector. Customers, particularly for companies that are consumer-facing, are looking for that alignment, and values kind of match with a company. Similar to employees, communities, and unions are looking for the concept of a just transition, how it's going to impact, the company's transition is going to impact those communities. As we'll talk about more later, governments are increasingly developing regulations that require disclosure and development of transition plans. NGOs likewise have been at the forefront of developing guidance in the voluntary sector for transition planning, and they're also serving the dual role of assessing a company's ambition and then their performance towards their transition plan goals. So if we go to the next slide, we'll go a little more in depth in terms of some of the regulatory drivers and some of the other stakeholders that we just outlined. So the European Union's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive requires companies to report out on these elements of a transition plan. They're outlined here. And it is important to note that the EU CSRD regulation is broader than just companies that are based in the EU, but foreign companies that have significant operations within the EU will also be covered by this regulation on a little bit of a lagged timeline. I think the other important thing to kind of point out for the CSRD, and that it's unique and that it adopts a double materiality standard. So I think people are familiar with the concept of financial materiality. CSRD also requires reporting on the concept of impact materiality. So the impact that your actions may have on people or the environment will also then be pulled into the CSRD reporting. If we go to the next slide, In terms of kind of US regulatory drivers, the Securities and Exchange Commission passed their climate-related disclosures rule earlier this year. It's since been stayed as it's being challenged in the court. I think, the difference from the CSRD here is that it only embodies the concept of financial materiality, and it's less rigorous in terms of requiring the development of a transition plan and more focused on disclosure of a plan that already exists. And then California has also passed a rule recently on climate-related financial risk. This is in line with the disclosure of risks and opportunities that are required if you're reporting to the TCFD standard as well. So if we go to the next slide. In terms of investors, Investor Climate Action Plans released their four-tier ladder for engagement of public companies to encourage them to develop a plan to take on climate action. So they have representing companies, investment managers with over 40 trillion assets under management, and have kind of been at the forefront of driving at least public companies' disclosure of their climate actions. If we go to the next slide, similarly, State Street Advisors has developed their own kind of hierarchy of items that should be disclosed for a transition plan. So as an investor, when you're looking at a real economy sector company, they've outlined the items that you should be looking at, such as ambition and targets. They also explicitly call out the TCFD disclosure as well. And in particular, this concept of alignment comes up again. So if you have a plan to address climate change, how is your capital being allocated to match up with that plan? So to make sure that those two are in alignment as well. We go to the next slide. In terms of NGO influence, it falls into these three broad buckets. Target setting. So the kind of the most well-known in the target setting space is the Science-Based Targets Initiative that are helping companies develop science-aligned targets, as we mentioned earlier, that ambition that's in line with the Paris Agreement. In terms of guidance, TCFD has been mentioned quite often, and then also the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero has developed specific guidance on transition planning. CDP also has specific low carbon transition planning technical notes and then assessments that they've done. And then the last bucket here is NGOs that are focused on the assessment. So Climate Action 100, Transition Pathway Initiative, Net Zero Tracker, all look at companies' public disclosures to see how they match against any number of these guidance, the TCFD, GFANS, CDP, CSRD, all of those, to make sure that there is plan alignment and that progress is being made. We go to the next slide. I mentioned the UN's high-level expert group previously, but they also came together specifically to address the credibility of transition plans. So there's 5 broad principles on the right that flow into 10 recommendations. And we'll touch a little bit more on that in a coming slide. But the focus here is, again, on making sure that there's credibility, and they kind of go a little bit further than some of the other guidance has in terms of what's required of a company to develop a credible transition plan. So if we go to the next section, we're going to talk a little bit about the research that we did on transition planning guidance, and just kind of the overall ecosystem of transition plans. If you go to the next slide, we've broken that into kind of 4 broad categories. So there's the reporting on the top line, and that's TCFD. The mandatory requirements, or soon to be mandatory, from the Securities and Exchange Commission, and then at the EU for EFRAG, and then kind of the global baseline that's set by the ISSB/IFRS standards. And the next level is specific transition planning guidance. So that's the GFANS guidance, the UK's Transition Plan Task Force, CDP, we mean business. The next level is target setting. So we mentioned Science-Based Targets Initiative. There's also the Science-Based Targets Network and the 1.5 degree C business playbook. And then the last line are those NGOs that are assessing. And we think it's important to include those because how you're going to be assessed is going to influence what goes into your plan. We go to the next slide. When we did kind of two crosswalks looking at the guidance for the transition planning guidance. We looked at, we used TCFD as kind of the framework in which to assess and crosswalk all of the guidance because it seems to have primacy and influenced many of the guidance that are already out there. So, influenced the California rule, the EU CSRD standards as well, the UK TPT as well. So it seemed like it made sense to use that as the framework to crosswalk all of the other guidance. And if we go to the next slide, we can see why this is important as TCFD has been kind of growing in popularity. And though it was broken out on the previous slide, it has since been kind of rolled into the ISSB standards. And so that has only kind of furthered its kind of primacy globally in terms of a standard. So if we go to the next slide, this is the crosswalk of the 9 guidance that we looked at in terms of how they line up with the TCFD pillars that are shown on the left here. I think the highest correspondence here is GFANZ, and then the UK TPT guidance. And TPT is built, if you've seen their guidance, they show a pyramid. So at the bottom is TCFD, layered on top of that is GFANZ, and then their unique requirements on top of that. Similarly, as I mentioned, you can see kind of high correspondence with the EU recording requirements as well there. So all supporting kind of the notion that TCFD has kind of primacy in terms of the transition planning guidance, though there are some differences. We go to the next slide. Kind of the commonalities are shown in the table here. There is kind of close alignment between TCFD and GFANZ, as we noted, and the same groups put those two guidance together. But the low carbon transition plan element, there's focus on kind of board oversight and approval, the management role. So, setting up a governance structure to manage that plan. And then in terms of the financial planning and value chain engagement for the strategy pieces. And then because it's TCFD, responded to climate related risks and opportunities. So if we go to the next slide. So what are some of the differences that come out? Some of the key ones are the use of carbon credits. So when can you use them? As we know, for SBTI, wants you only to use carbon credits for residual emissions. So after you've reduced all of your own emissions as much as possible. TPT wants you to make clear how you plan on using them, how significant a role that they are going to play in terms of your decarbonization strategy. Several of the guides also want companies to be mindful of looking at the climate nature nexus in their transition plan. So making sure that in pursuing your decarbonization goals, that there aren't negative nature impacts at the same time. We talked a little bit about kind of that financial internal alignment. There's also the desire for alignment in terms of public policy engagement. So if companies have set a plan, some guidance is looking for your external policy engagement to be aligned with that plan. So are you advocating for policies that are going to help you and other companies achieve your net zero ambitions, your low carbon ambitions? And then the concept of just transition, it gets called out explicitly by several frameworks. GFANZ and series have highlighted the importance of kind of, again, just as you don't want to have negative nature impacts in the transition, you also want to ensure that the the transition is just in terms of equity for employees and communities that companies operate in. So if we go to the next slide, please. The other thing we looked at, again, was that second set of guidance I mentioned that was specifically focused on credibility. So what are the elements that are required for a plan to be considered credible? This crosswalk is a little bit different because there wasn't something similar to TCFD that was broadly accepted as an organizing guidance. So the primary dimensions you see on the left there are something that we pulled out after looking at the commonalities across all of the guidance. And so that was net zero targets, net zero strategy, policy and engagement, transparency and verification, nature and just transition, and then governance. And then there's a couple of components that they're called out that are different because they're not specifically plan elements. That's around, again, the carbon credit use, the phasing out of fossil fuels. So the high-level expert group from the UN specifically calls out a credible strategy is requiring a commitment to phase out fossil fuels. There's also several guidances that require particular planning methods for the plan itself to be deemed credible. So if we go to the next slide, we can kind of highlight that. So some guidance require a risk review, but then also scenario analysis to be done in order for the resulting transition plan to be deemed credible. And as we mentioned earlier, there are also guidance that require specific strategy elements. So phasing out fossil fuels is an example, ramping up renewable energy is another example, and then, as we previously touched on, the strategy for how carbon credits get used. So there are guidance that are prescribing, particular strategy components and planning methods in addition to just kind of the base level components of what should be in the strategy itself. So we go to the next slide. We're going to talk now about research findings from both the research we did on the guidance and then the interviews that we conducted. So if we go to the next slide. So high-level research findings. We started out with the companies we interviewed, and we wanted to do this, what we thought was going to be a simple graph that's showing here. And the goal was to highlight the baseline year, the 2030 commitment, the 2050 commitment, and kind of how that would play out over time. What we found is that most of the targets that we reviewed lacked enough specificity to do something like this. So in particular, there was a lack of specification of that kind of end 2050 level of carbon reduction that was going to happen. Is it 70%? Is it 80%? And in many cases, it was undefined. So that makes it hard for stakeholders, investors, et cetera, to understand, are you on track or not? If we don't know what you're shooting for in the end state, then it's hard to assess kind of whether or not a company is on track or not. And then the distinction between planning for the transition versus a transition plan. So 5 of the 12 companies 12 of the companies we interviewed had a transition plan. 2 of the 14 did not. 5 of those had a standalone plan. So then that leaves stakeholders to review an existing sustainability report to try and pick out the elements of what is the company's transition plan. As a side note, none of the guidance we reviewed required a standalone plan. The closest that a guidance got to requiring a standalone plan is the UK TPT suggested that it is best practice to periodically pull all the elements of your transition plan together in a standalone report. And then just noting a CDP study done in 2023, they had, as I mentioned earlier, had identified 21 key indicators of a transition plan. And of the over 18,000 respondents they reviewed, 69% disclosed 0 to 7, but less than 0.5% disclosed all 21 of those transition plan key indicators. So we go to the next slide. In terms of interview findings, in terms of what helped companies to be successful, Top level is just senior level commitment is important. There were several companies that were trying to kind of manage from the middle to get a target set and a transition plan developed, and they found that road much more difficult to walk. So having that tone set at the top has made it much easier for companies to kind of work across teams, get cross-functional participation. I guess the next thing we'll highlight too is guidance overload and lack of credible actors. And what do we mean by that? So as we noted, there was, I think, 9 transition plan guidance and multiple guidance on credibility. And so that's left a lot of the companies we interviewed kind of trying to assess what's the most important guidance to follow, and which one is going to, make that end plan seem credible once it's released. There was also the acknowledgement too that, because there's so many, there's no longer, they think, one guidance that's going to confer credibility to whatever that comes out. How some of the companies managed around that was a lot of them engaged external stakeholders earlier on in the process to ensure that whatever they came out with was deemed credible. So they, picked, their most important stakeholders from the map that we showed earlier and engaged them as they were generating their plan to ensure that, it wasn't going to meet resistance immediately once it was released. Knowledge gaps. A lot of the requirements in a transition plan is difficult. And so, there was a lot of knowledge gaps that had to be assessed. So some of the strategies to close these gaps, we're looking at, what are peer companies doing? Reassessing how, internal roles and responsibilities can be allocated to address some of the requirements of a transition plan. Same with the data management strategies. And then also, lots of companies, if they saw a gap in the short term and were under the gun to build something, they would engage consultants to kind of backfill for that knowledge gap. We go to the next slide. There was a tension between kind of what was deemed aspirational versus obtainable goals. So some companies in a sector would see a peer set a goal that they, didn't believe that they had line of sight in terms of, how to achieve that. We'll touch a little bit more on that later, but I think the companies that were setting what was deemed aspirational would just say that they were science-aligned goals and that the goal is divorced from the strategy, and that you need to set that goal to make sure that you're kind of striving for what makes sense in terms of the environment. I think the other thing that stood out as well was there was a gulf in the expectations around the level of transparency that many of these guidance are calling for. The UNH group, called out for radical transparency from companies. I think, every company we talk to is, not in a place where they think that they can be that transparent. The primary concern is that whatever they release will essentially be used against them. So companies also mentioned that if we say we're going to do an activity at plant A and it ends up being at plant B, we're still going to, be taken to task for that. So there's a lot of concern around this greater level of transparency that's being called for, kind of having, negative blowback for companies in terms of, their public, perception and image. I think too, the observation was made too, is that they're asking for a level of transparency that companies wouldn't usually provide for any other aspect of their business. And so kind of thinking through how that works is also a chore for companies. The next one, lack of interim targets and measures. I mean, similar to what we observed earlier with, that lack of specification for the 2050 goal. Most companies we talk to, have set a 2030 and a 2050 target in line with the kind of UN strictures in terms of, where we need to be. 50% reduction by 2030, net zero by 2050. But then there's a 20-year gap between those 2 years where very few companies have kind of shown where they expect to be in their decarbonization trajectory. And so again, that makes it difficult for stakeholders to kind of assess whether you're on track, and they're only left with the kind of that lagging measure of carbon emissions. And then just finally touching again on just transition. Most of the companies we talked to kind of acknowledged its importance, but many were kind of, I guess, lagging in their understanding in terms of best practices, how to assess it, how to kind of, do that stakeholder map for just transition. I think the one sector we'd call out is the utility sector, which seemed to have a much more robust just transition plan. And I think that's down to their, decades of experience doing stakeholder outreach with all of their customers as well. So we go on to the next slide. We're going to kind of wrap up with some high-level recommendations. These fall into three main buckets around improving planning, transparency, and performance. So, circling back to the lack of that long-term target, the first recommendation is just to fully specify those short and long-term targets. Again, kind of connecting to that lack of interim targets. There's an ISO net zero standard that we call out that says interim targets should be specified every 2 to 5 years. So we understand kind of, with better clarity what your path is. And then to the observation that we've heard from companies about too much guidance, we've asked NGOs and others to start the process of converging guidance. And I think we're already seeing some of that as TCFD has gone into ISSB just recently. The UK TPT has also been absorbed into the ISSB. So I think, that will help give some clarity, remove some of the players from the board in terms of making that initial decision about which guidance you should follow. In terms of enhancing transparency, as we mentioned before, many of the companies we interviewed didn't have a standalone transition plan, so we've already kind of moved out on development of a transition plan content index. So, many of you may be familiar with GRI. That also, if you don't do a separate GRI plan, you do an index. So similar idea, simple for companies then to specify kind of where are the components of their transition plan. Also trying to help create an environment that encourages greater transparency around strategy, areas of uncertainty, interdependency. And this kind of graphic on the right is to show that transition planning is iterative. And so this encouraging greater transparency, we think, is going to require movement on, both part of the company, but then also, the NGOs and the other groups that are assessing them. If you have a 2050 plan, it's probably not right, and that's okay. And so that's why, having a strong governance structure in place to update the plan as policy changes, as technology changes, as, kind of the overall global economy changes is important. So no single plan is going to be the answer for a company in their path to decarbonization. So just normalizing that, yes, it's iterative and that it's important to, take it in context, and, the plan is going to change, the target shouldn't. And then the last thing, is kind of focusing in on planning and governance, not a specific plan. If we go to the next slide, I just wanted to highlight an example here too about, kind of the transparency, and then kind of, what you have control of, what you don't have control of. So BHP has done a nice job. They've laid out their emissions, scope 1 and 2, and then their upstream and downstream scope 3 emissions, and highlighted, what are the areas that we have direct control of? What are the areas that we need to partner to make something happen to ensure that our plan, is implemented? And then where do we need to go out and advocate and influence to make sure that, say, a policy is changed to enable their, implementation of their plan? So that, again, is important because it's also a signal to NGOs like C2ES that, in the influence category, if companies are all saying, we need permitting reform in order to decarbonize, then that's something that NGOs like C2ES can take up and help move forward. And then just to note too that these actions are supported and aligned with their capital plan. We go to the next slide. Also in terms of shifting the focus is to kind of look at and lay out kind of how is credibility defined. And so we've kind of mapped out perceived versus real credibility, but the focus in the end needs to be on real credibility is going to be a function of performance. So are you making progress, and are you transparent about how you're planning to make progress? So we go to the next slide. Just touching a little bit again too on shifting that focus from planning to performance. So a lot of guidance has come out on the planning side. There isn't as much guidance in terms of what is credible performance going forward, because credibility derived from having a good plan is a wasting asset. You can't rely on a good plan for years without eventually showing progress. So kind of giving more guidance, laying out the expectations in terms of what performance should be looking like in the future. And then again, just highlighting the need to better integrate just transition into kind of all of this. If we go to the next slide, as I mentioned earlier, utilities have been doing a very good job in terms of integrating that into their plan. So we wanted to call out Southern Company here, which actually has developed their own standalone plan in terms of just transition and laid out some principles there. So, for companies that are newer to this process, I think it's a great resource to look at and kind of understand how a company that's been kind of historically engaged with their stakeholders, how they're approaching just transition. So I'm going to wrap up now just with a few next steps that we're taking for the low carbon transition planning project. So we can go to the next slide. We're doing a couple of things, building on the research that we've already done here. Mentioned kind of the intersection with the financial sector and reeconomy transition planning, specifically around TCFD. In the interviews, companies, called out the financial sector as being the most influential, though they did also note that there's, I think, opportunity for the financial sector to ask better questions of them, provide better guidance in terms of what they're looking for. So we're starting to do some research there. I mentioned, all the companies we talked to, we asked them about kind of their interdependencies in terms of achieving their own goals. We're doing a deeper dive for the utility sector. And just this past June, we held a roundtable with a number of utilities in the finance sector to talk about kind of what their main interdependencies are. So I know a lot of companies call out the decarbonization of the grid to achieve their own net zero ambitions, but what is the utility sector? Who are they dependent upon? What has to happen for them? And as I previously mentioned, kind of one of the biggest things they flagged for us was permitting reform to help build out renewable energy, et cetera. So we'll continue to work on that interdependency analysis as well. And then finally, to help try and implement some of the recommendations that we outline in the plan. So the first piece we're moving out on is we'll be developing a transition plan index that companies can use when they've decided not to do a standalone plan, but to weave it into their own existing sustainability report. So I'm going to wrap up there. Next, Rachel Kavanaugh from Intel is going to share a little bit about how they went about doing their own transition plan. Rachel.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Nick. So my name is Rachel Kavanaugh. I manage Intel's climate change program for our direct operations. And I was also responsible for leading the effort for Intel to develop our first climate transition action plan, which we published in November of 2023. So I have a few slides. I'm going to start hitting our goals just at a high level. I'll talk a little bit about why a company would want to develop a transition plan. I'll give some tips on how to make a transition plan successful, and then kind of wrap up with how companies can go ahead and implement the plan that they've developed. So this is just a high-level overview of Intel's climate-related goals. As you can see, our goals span our full value chain. So we have goals related to operations, which is where my focus is. We have that net zero goal by 2040 for Scope 1 and Scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions. We also have a net zero goal for our upstream Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, and then a number of goals focused on reducing the embodied carbon of our products. And then just on kind of how we progressed so far. So in support of that net zero target for operations, we have a number of 2030 goals as well. One of those is to achieve a 10% reduction in absolute Scope 1 and Scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And the other is to achieve 100% renewable electricity globally. And so we've shown progress in 2023, so far of a 43% absolute emissions reduction in Scope 1 and Scope 2, and then achieving 99% renewable electricity globally. And so before I jump into the kind of the how you'd want to set up a plan, I'm going to focus a little bit on the why. So why is it beneficial for companies to spend the resources and the time to develop a climate transition action plan? The first is an opportunity to increase a company's transparency and accountability by documenting a company's path to achieve their greenhouse gas reduction goals. So instead of just going out and saying, hey, these are my targets, a company has the opportunity to articulate their path to achieve them. Jumping off that point, it's also an opportunity to solidify a company's climate strategy. So as many of you may know, oftentimes those roadmaps to achieve our goals are developed at the working level. So this is an opportunity to ensure that you are aligned throughout your management hierarchy on that reduction roadmap that's been developed as part of this transition plan. One of the key components of transition planning is the identification and assessing of climate-related risks and opportunities across your full value chain. So another opportunity is by engaging cross-organizational stakeholders. A company can better assess which risks that they have that they need to mitigate, which opportunities you have that need to be more fully realized, and then develop that strategy to address both those risks and those opportunities. And finally, there could be external pressure. So that could come from investors and customers and potentially governments looking for companies to develop that roadmap and that path to transition to a net zero economy. So next on the how. And so these are just some steps that Intel took as we put together our plan. This is not an all-inclusive list, but some of the things that I thought would be most relevant and important. The first and foremost, and this is something that Nick talked about in his presentation and is also highlighted in that report, the first step was to determine which guideline or framework we were going to use as our guideline in setting up that transition plan. So, this meant looking at all of the different standards and guidelines and frameworks and credibility criteria that existed and determining which we found to be the most holistic. And Nick also mentioned this as well, but then working with some of our external stakeholders to make sure that if we developed a transition plan, that it would be in line with their expectations as well. And ultimately, we ended up using TCFD's guidelines on metrics, targets, and transition plans as our guideline in putting together our own transition plan. The next piece is it's kind of basic and straightforward, but starting with what you know. So Nick mentioned that there's no requirement that you have a standalone plan. That is the direction that Intel went. And so what we found in looking at TCFD's guideline and cross-referencing against our corporate social responsibility report, our CDP disclosure, various risk analyses and road mapping that we had done internally, is that a lot of the information already existed, just in different places. So what we needed to do was, pull that together, make sure that we had a cohesive story, and then perform a gap analysis. That's that third bullet there. So now that we knew what we had, where are the areas that we needed to go address in order to be able to publish this plan? And ultimately, what we found in our case is that we needed to formalize and further refine our scenario analysis. And then we needed to develop a roadmap across our value chain that we could share externally. This next bullet, I think one of the key reasons that we were successful in publishing this plan is because we engaged with cross-company experts and stakeholders early and then often. And I've listed out a few of the groups that we worked with, also not an exhaustive list, but it just gives you an idea that in developing this plan, making sure that you're taking a lot of the different groups that have a stake in this plan along with you, especially starting in the beginning, can be really helpful to the success of the overall publication of that plan and implementation of that plan as well. One of the items that seems to be consistent in all of those different standards and guidelines and frameworks that exist is they look for companies to have that climate oversight at the highest level of the company, typically at that board of directors level. So making sure that if you don't already have a path to communicate your climate related goals, progress and risks to the board, the CTAP can be an action that's taken as part of the development of your CTAP. And then the last bullet here is one of the most important in my opinion, and something that Nick mentioned as well at the end of his presentation. And that's that this is an iterative process. And that's something that our team kept in mind as we went through. In our first year, we would focus on closing all of those key gaps that needed to be closed and refining where we could within our development timeline, but knowing that we would need to go back and further refine our transition plan in future years. And so I mentioned that one of the things that we really needed to focus on as part of the development of our CTAP is developing a roadmap. And so I've listed out here, this is a snapshot of the roadmap that's available in our transition plan. And it's on page 10. I believe Philip probably put a link to it in the chat there if you'd like to go see a more holistic version. This is something that we had internally. We had developed internal roadmaps on how we're planning to achieve our goals, but this was a key area of interest for our customers. And this graphic here illustrates some of those lines. This is also an opportunity for companies to highlight those things that are challenging or that are maybe unique to your industry. So in the case of Intel and semiconductor manufacturing in general, we're uniquely challenged by the fact that we use fluorinated greenhouse gases in our manufacturing operations without known substitutes. And so we really wanted to highlight or use this roadmap as an opportunity to highlight that there are multiple paths that our industry and Intel can take, depending on how things develop over the next few years. And then the main takeaway from this slide is really that to develop a roadmap, you need to look across your entire value chain. So you can't just focus on your operations. You can't just focus on your supply chain or your products. You need to look holistically at your emissions profile and determine what your actions are in each of those areas to transition to a low carbon economy. And so this is my last slide here. I've talked a little bit about why and how to develop a transition plan. And this slide, I think, articulates the most important part, and that's the considerations for how you actually go and implement that plan. As I mentioned on a previous slide, we coalesced a cross-company team to develop our CTAP. And I think that was really helpful because that team can now go manage the ongoing plan updates and tracking of progress towards the goals that we outlined in our transition plan. In addition, I think it's critical to have smaller focused teams that are really focused on implementing the roadmap that you've identified in your plan, especially because the key action items for your direct operations are going to be likely very different than the key actions that need to be managed to address the emissions from your supply chain. Another thing to note is that for implementation, oftentimes there are industry-wide challenges that need to be addressed to really decarbonize your sector. So one of the things that Intel did and that we talk about in our transition plan is that we were a founding member of something called the Semiconductor Climate Consortium. And that consortium brings together companies throughout the semiconductor value chain to address greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And finally, developing that CTEP is not going to be a one and done. It will be really important and critical really to continue engaging with all of the stakeholders that were engaged in the process of developing it, and then also all the way up through your management hierarchy. So I'll pause there. We have a little bit of time left, and I'll pass it back over to Nick so we can kick off Q&A.
Thanks, Rachel. I think since we've still got you here, there was one question about Intel's 99% renewable energy goal and kind of how that was achieved. Was it a VPPA, RECs? And I think they're echoing some of the concerns we've heard recently about it, are buying RECs kind of seen as a credible strategy. So could you tell us a little bit about how Intel approached that?
Yeah, Intel has a portfolio approach to renewable electricity. So our portfolio includes kind of all of the above, PPAs, RECs, and then we also have on-site renewable electricity. So we kind of look at it holistically, and then we closely monitor, where things are shifting to. So we talk in our transition plan about how we are aligned to the greenhouse gas protocol and the requirements there. We're also members of RE100. And so as requirements shift, we'll continue to adapt to address those.
Great, thanks. We've got another question here about, and I think, Rachel, you touched on some of this, but advice for companies just starting, one or two guidance they should follow kind of as you're starting this journey, what should you be doing? I think I would just say kind of in the hierarchy, if there's something mandatory, then you should pay attention to that first. If you're looking for the one guidance to follow, I think the UK TPT kind of layers the three things together that are the crosswalk showed are the most kind of relevant, prevalent, out there. So TCFD, GFANs, and then their own kind of additions. So I think that would be a good starting place. And then I guess the last piece I would add to that, and Rachel, if you have something to add, I'd love to hear that too, but is that as Intel did, who are your primary stakeholders? Who are you already hearing from? What do they think you need to do to be credible? So I don't know if you have other things to add to that list.
No, I mean, I'd echo the same. I think that the regulatory landscape has shifted significantly in the last, year or two. And so the reason for putting together a transition plan in many cases has shifted from something that was voluntary to something that's going to become mandatory. So looking at, making sure you're addressing all of those mandatory requirements up front before looking at everything else, I think is critical at this point.
Yeah, yeah. There was another question on how you kind of satisfy, and work with investors. And I guess my two pieces of advice, but then Rachel would love to hear your kind of advice here is look at what is being asked of them. So that's typically going to flow down. So GFANs has spawned lots of guidance for the financial sector. So, what are they being asked to do? How are they being asked to measure kind of the greening of their own portfolios? And then just simply dialogue, reach out to them proactively and kind of what are they going to be looking for in terms of, a company's transition plan and the progress that they're making.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think another thing, something that we've seen is a lot of these investors are investors in your industry as well. So looking at what your industry is doing as a whole, the direction of other companies within your industry, what are they doing, what kind of goals have they set, can give you some insight into maybe even the direction that investors will start going.
Yeah, and I guess a question for you, Rachel, would be, you mentioned the kind of consortium that Intel is working with. Do you think that is advantageous then in working with your investors to kind of show progress? Does that work well for all the companies?
I think so. I think it shows collaboration as an industry, which I think, like I mentioned, I really think is critical for many sectors. I think, when it comes to climate change and emissions reduction, like no company can really go it alone. It's a global problem. So the more we are bringing along, others in our industry and kind of, working with suppliers and doing that all together, I think really helps solve the problem, and show those right next steps.
Yeah, and I think that's true of many other industries as well, as they look for, particularly we've seen along technology development. So if something has to be, made cost effective, doing that pre-competitive cooperation to help make that come to pass has been really important. There's also, I think, maybe this will be the last question, but an observation that companies are only going to do these things if it makes financial sense. And so how do you kind of bridge that gap? I guess a couple of observations I would make is that's the importance, I think, too, of the transparency. So in the BHP example, one of the things you can observe is that this doesn't make financial sense. So does a piece of technology need to become economic? Does the government need to provide some subsidies to stand up an industry so that a transition can happen? I think that's kind of the tension between that aspirational versus obtainable goal. Because if you only shoot for the attainable, then you're never going to identify all those other things that need to happen. So it's absolutely a part of transition planning. I think it's also perfectly legitimate to say, hey, here's where things, a gap needs to be filled, and it doesn't necessarily have to be just the company or its sector to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where road mapping becomes so important as well. So once you actually look at all of the opportunities you have to reduce emissions across your value chain, you can kind of focus in on what are those critical projects I can do now that maybe do have that lower capital investment, and kind of work your way, and knowing that technology is going to progress in the next 10 to 15 years. So how can you map out your roadmap so it takes into consideration the financial element as well?
Right, right. Well, I think kind of we're near time. We're going to wrap up here. So I just want to thank everybody for attending. Thank you, Rachel, for providing the perspective from Intel. The recording for this webinar will be available on YouTube, I think tomorrow sometime. The report's available on C2ES's website. And for anybody who's interested in learning more, participating, feel free to reach out to me or anybody else at C2ES. So we'll end there and say thanks to everyone for participating.